Hello, today I will be talking about childhood trauma. Let's get started. So, first, starting off with the introduction, what is trauma? What is childhood trauma? So, childhood trauma is when one experiences abuse or neglect as a child, and it can have a significant impact on a child's quality of life. This impact can be felt across several areas, such as emotional health, physical health, mental health, and personal relationships. It's when a child feels intensely threatened by an event he or she is involved in or witnesses. It can be emotionally painful or distressful, which can often result in lasting mental and physical effects. And these experiences can become overwhelming and negatively affect the child throughout their development and throughout the course of their childhood. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, these experiences can be distressful and can be long lasting. So the types of trauma that we do have that one can experience is acute trauma, which is a single event. And then there's chronic trauma, which is a repetitive event over long periods of times. And then there's complex trauma, which is an exposure to multiple traumatic events and often invasive interpersonal nature, and the wide-ranging long-term impacts of the exposure can be detrimental. And for this particular presentation, I'm going to look at trauma caused by physical abuse. So please keep that in mind throughout this presentation. And so the types of trauma that one can have are sexual or physical emotional abuse. It can be witnessing or experiencing violence in a home. It can be parents getting sick or being put into prison, a divorce, parents who use substances or alcohol dependent, natural disasters. Obviously, physical and emotional neglect are types of trauma, and any physical or sexual abuse. Now, to understand childhood trauma, I'm going to be applying 3 theoretical frameworks. And the first framework that I will be looking at is Piaget's cognitive theory, which is when children are able to construct their own reality. Piaget says that meanings are created through the use of language, and every individual creates their own meanings through the use of language. Children are always constructing their own ideas of how the world works, and they come up with these mental schemes to kind of organize the reality, and then they're able to take in new data and change their schemas to fit with whatever situation that they're dealing with at that time. So with Piaget's cognitive theory, there are something called the schemas, which are the building blocks of knowledge. Now, these schemas are our internal cognitive structures, such as beliefs, values, attitudes, norms, which is done through a learning process. It's how we organize our knowledge. These schemas influence how we react to and understand new information or situations, which then leads into assimilation. Assimilation are existing schemas, which helps one to deal with new objects, situations, and information. If the existing schema is unable to help you with new encounters, then one would need to make an accommodation. An accommodation is one modifies the schema to deal with that new object or situation. If a child is able to process these new objects or situations, they will enter a state of equilibrium. And if they're unable to assimilate, deal with new information, then they will enter a state of disequilibrium. Adjustments to schemas can happen throughout one's entire life, so you can always make adjustments as needed. Now, going into the 4 stages of Piaget's cognitive theory, there is something called the sensory motor, which is from 0 to 2. It's when a child begins to understand the world through senses and actions, such as looking, hearing, touching, and mouthing or grasping. The goal is object permanence, which is knowing an object is there even if you can't see it. Then we move into the pre-operational stage, which is 2 to 7 years old. This is when knowledge is created through the use of symbols and words, and imagination and memory is developing. Children are very egocentric. They're very about themselves, still trying to figure themselves out, obviously. And then we move into the concrete operational stage, which is when abstract thinking begins to occur, and children are able to think logically about events and objects, and they begin to comprehend how things work, which allows them to think objectively about themselves and the world. Then we move into the formal operational stage, which is when children's abstract thinking is in full effect, and they can think logically about abstract propositions and be able to test hypotheses. The next theory that I will be applying will be Erikson's theory, which this theory helps us to recognize societal influences and addresses culture within the context of linear stages. Now, Erikson says that each individual is going to go through these 8 stages, and through each of these stages, one is going to acquire a virtue. And so if you're able to successfully complete each of these stages, then you move forward to the next stage. And if you're not, then it kind of impacts your development, which is not good. So some assumptions and principles of Erikson is that every human has the same basic needs, and ego development occurs in these stages. If the stage is completed, and it will result in a healthy personality, and you will acquire that said virtue. And as far as principles, it's acknowledging that basic needs each person has and supporting those needs through each of those stages. Now, the 8 stages, there is trust versus mistrust, which is when children will develop a sense of trust when caregivers provide reliability, care, and affection. If they do not have that, then there will be a lack of trust throughout their relationships and throughout their development. Stage 2 is autonomy versus shame and doubt, which is when children need to develop a sense of personal control over physical skills and a sense of independence. If they are successful, then this leads to autonomy. If they fail, then they will have feelings of shame and doubt. And in stage 3, initiative versus guilt, this is when children begin to start asserting control and power over the environment. And if they're successful, this leads to a sense of purpose. And if they do not, then they result in a sense of guilt. Stage 4 is industry versus inferiority. And this is when children are developing to be able to cope with new social and academic demands. And if they're successful, this will lead to competence. If they're not, then they will have a feeling of inferiority. Identity versus role confusion is when teenagers are just trying to figure themselves out, seeing where they fit in, finding groups, people to relate to. If they are successful, then they will be able to stay true to themselves. If they are not, then this will lead to a little bit of role confusion. Intimacy versus isolation is the next stage. This is when adults are forming intimate relationships. If they are able to be successful, they will have strong relationships. If they are not, then this will result in loneliness and isolation. Generativity versus stagnation are when adults are able to pass down information to the next generation. If they are not, then they will feel a sense of they won't feel useful, or they will not feel accomplished, which will result in shallow involvement in the world. And then ego, identity versus despair are when older adults kind of look back on their life, and if they feel a sense of fulfillment, then they will acquire wisdom and be able to this will lead to feeling successful and feeling like you've acquired something and like you weren't just terrible in your life. If you look back on your life and feel like you didn't really accomplish anything, then you'll feel some regret and despair, which is never good. Now, the third theory that I will be applying is social constructionism, which is actually 2 words put into one, which is constructivism, and social constructionism, which equals social constructivism. Some of these assumptions of this theory are that it focuses on how people learn through interaction with others to classify the world and their place in it. It's how we define things, and how it indicates how knowledge, symbols, rules, and concepts are how those things shape how individuals construct and interpret the world. We construct meanings through interactions, and those interactions help us to create language that give meaning to our experiences. People who hold power are the people who influence how meaning is created, and individuals are shaped and influenced by culture. Some principles of this theory are that it highlights contextual experiences and recognizes diversity. It recognizes the importance of language and the meanings that words hold, and it does not support the notion of stage-based theories. Now, Constructivism is when reality is constructed through one's biological and developmental process. In the human mind, there is an emphasis on the micro level of interaction in individuals, creations, and meanings. It focuses on the individual, its micro level, and nature, which is genetic or hormone-based behaviors or traits. It's your genes. Social constructionism is when reality is constructed through the use of language and interactions with others and is influenced by history, society, and culture. There's an emphasis on macro level of interaction and social creation of meaning, and it does not take biological factors into account. The power in society influences how meaning is created. And again, I said this one specifically focuses on the social, macro, and nurture, which is meaning created socially through interaction, which is the environment, culture, and experiences. These two combined are social constructivism, which is a reality that is influenced by social and individual biological factors, which influence meanings. Nature and nurture are both addressed. Some effects of childhood trauma are emotionally are like anger. It's when children are maybe unresponsive. They have the inability to express their emotions or how they're feeling with words. It could be anxiety or depression, panic attacks. They may feel helpless or have cognitive distortions, which can lead to negative feelings and cause one to feel bad about themselves. Now, childhood trauma affects a child cognitively. And so children may have problems like thinking clearly, reasoning or problem solving, unable to plan ahead. They may have trouble calmly like thinking about something and considering alternatives. They may show deficits in language, struggle with attention span or learning new information or applying that information. They just have difficulties understanding things, especially in school environments. It can be very difficult for them. Surviving abuse or trauma has been linked to higher rates of anxiety and depression, suicide and self-harm, PTSD, drug and alcohol misuse, and relationship difficulties. Childhood trauma does affect one physically. They could have sleep issues, insomnia, they could have stomach pain, they could have headaches, they could sweat all the time, they could be jittery, they may not eat, they may have a low immune system. As far as socially, children who are impacted by childhood trauma, they tend to have a mistrust towards a lot of people. Talking with others may be difficult. Having friendships may be hard because they don't trust anyone. They can be verbally abusive or just really aggressive. They may lack confidence. They may have no eye contact when they're speaking with you. And they may act out uncontrollably and demand attention with negative behaviors. As far as human development and how childhood trauma affects that, so stress impacts development on the brain and nervous system. They have children later in life will have trouble making attachments, making relationships, making friendships. Their physical health is impacted, which can lead to later, heart disease, possibly cancers. Cognitive abilities, problems with focusing, problems with retaining information, emotional regulation. They have trouble conveying empathy, sympathy. They may be unable to talk about their feelings. Those feelings of sadness may transcend as aggression. They may have difficulty controlling impulses, guilt, shame, body issues, self-harm. Childhood trauma affects on all levels of human development. Now moving on to a case study. This is the case that I will be using. It's Brian. He's a 10-year-old boy who was sent to the principal's office. He's been acting out, hitting teachers, getting into fights with kids, and he's been hospitalized. He cuts himself. He's had suicide attempts. He lives in poverty. He has a brother and two sisters. His parents used to be drug addicts. They have been clean for 10 years. And so I'm going to be making assumptions about this. I don't know everything. So I'm assuming that it's possible that he may be enduring physical abuse, whether it's from his parents or from his siblings, perhaps, or maybe friends. We don't necessarily know that information. So again, these are all assumptions that I'm making about Brian in order to understand the effects that I just mentioned about emotionally, cognitively, socially. I'm going to be applying the three theoretical frameworks in order to help me to understand those effects that I've just briefly mentioned. So applying Piaget's cognitive theory, how does this help us understand Brian? Well, one, this theory clarifies the effects of Brian emotionally and cognitively. Emotionally, it appears he has feelings of anger and emotional outbursts. He could possibly be depressed. He has developed a schema believing that it is okay to fight. Perhaps he constructed a reality through the use of language and interactions with his siblings and parents. Maybe there's like a lot of aggression that's going on. And so his schemas are that he believes it's okay to hit others and destroy property. His assimilation is that he was sent to the principal's office. He will either learn or choose to ignore that. And hopefully he realizes that it's not okay to hit others. And his accommodation has been to self-harm and to have suicidal attempts. And as far as his sensory motor, I'm thinking maybe his parents weren't really around. I mean, his parents had stopped using when he was born. I'm thinking perhaps his parents had some sort of ill feelings towards him because that's the reason why they had to stop. So maybe he was neglected by his parents. No attachments were made. In the pre-operational stage, perhaps his cognitive skills were not gained. He still exhibits egocentric habits. His concrete operational, he's unable to think logically. He's having issues understanding information in school. He's having low academic achievements. And his formal operational, he's not able to identify consequences for actions and unable to problem solve. He has deficits in his learning right now. Cognitively, he's inability to problem solve. And again, like I mentioned, he has low academic achievements. He's struggling in school, although his parents say that they're into reading and helping their children out. We really don't know if that information is accurate, especially if we're looking at his emotional outbursts and his low academic achievements. Some strengths and limitations of cognitive theory are that one of the strengths is that it helps us to understand how trauma affects a child cognitively. If a child is unable to reason or think using hypothesis, or it is possible that they endured some type of trauma. Some limitations to this theory is that it lacks attention to cultural factors in a child's life, and it does not address environmental factors and how those factors may have influenced his erratic behavior and children who may be dealing with trauma. Assuming that Brian experienced childhood trauma, based on the cognitive theory, that trauma will impact the way he perceives himself, and it will negatively affect his behavior and his feelings, which he's already showing. And some possible suggestions to enhance this lens would be that it would be neat if it did recognize cultural, environmental factors, because those do play a role in childhood trauma. Now, applying Erikson's 8 stages, this theory helps us to understand childhood trauma socially and physically and cognitively. So in stage 1, trust versus mistrust were where Brian's basic needs were met. Attachment should have been made to parents. If not, due to neglect, Brian will now have trust issues and feel like he can't rely on others. He won't trust people in the world. In stage 2, autonomy versus doubt. This is socially and cognitively affect him. He will have the inability to problem solve, and he will doubt his abilities. his parents maybe never helped him gain independence. So now he feels doubt and shame. Um, he can't problem solve. So maybe that's why he's fighting now with the two older boys, because he's not able to accurately speak his feelings to them and maybe see what's going on, what the issue is. So he, instead of talking the situation out, he's now acting out in aggressive behavior. In stage 3, initiative versus guilt. Perhaps Brian has made goals but is unable to achieve them, so now he has guilt. His guilt leads him to physically have night terrors, maybe lack of energy or sleep disturbances. Those are effects of childhood trauma. And in stage 4, industry versus inferiority, this is the stage Brian is currently in. So right now he's unable to keep up with social and academic demands. He's picking fights. He may feel less competent because of his low academic achievements. And he will continue to struggle with these, according to Erickson, if these stages aren't conquered. Now, if we were to proceed throughout his life in stage 5, he'll have identity versus role confusion. He will search for a sense of self. He's demanding attention with negative behaviors. He lacks confidence and lacks ability to challenge self or pursue goals. In stage 6, intimacy versus isolation, he will have trouble forming relationships. He will not have love for himself. This can result in isolation and loneliness, which can lead to physical symptoms related to childhood trauma, such as heightened stress response and sleep issues. Stage 7, generativity versus stagnation, he will have no relationships formed. So no generations were formed to pass down information to. He will not have success or involvement in the world. And lastly, stage 8, Brian will not be satisfied with his life and he will be very unhappy. Notice how I put stage 6 between physically and socially and cognitively, because it kind of leads into both of those. It will affect Brian in both of those elements. Some strengths and limitations for Erickson are that the strengths are that one has the ability to go back and conquer these unresolved issues in stages related to trauma. He will be able to address development and growth throughout one's life and how trauma has affected those areas. Some limitations are that the individual may not live a stage-based life, so it's not applicable to everyone. Also, Erickson kind of gives like a one-size-fits-all description of a person's lifespan, and everybody deals with things differently. So I think, rather than going 1 stage, 2 stage, you could start off in the 4th stage. I mean, it's not consecutive to everybody. That doesn't apply to everybody. So some possible suggestions to enhance the lens are that perhaps stages can be acknowledged out of consecutive order and just be applied randomly to one's lifespan. Now, applying social constructivism. So social constructivism helps to understand childhood trauma and its effects on a person emotionally, cognitively, and socially. So emotionally and cognitively, he has feelings of anger. Interactions growing up were possibly aggressive and violent, so now he's kicking and fighting kids. Perhaps knowledge or his culture emphasizes violence, and interactions with his siblings were physical, and maybe this is why he's destroying property, lying, and blaming others. Now, socially, his interactions with environments and living in poverty could have possibly played a role in his aggression, which is a result of childhood trauma. Society also places a stigma on poverty. So maybe through those interactions with school systems, Brian has seen mistreatment, so now mistrusts the schooling system and demands attention with negative behaviors, verbally and physically. Abusive, which is a result of childhood trauma. He's verbally abusive to his peers and maybe physically abusive. As far as strengths for social constructivism, this theory helps one to understand how childhood trauma shapes their perspectives and how they view the world. The way a person acts depends on the way in which they understand or they give meaning to their behavior. So if one sees negative experiences and experiences negative, then it's pretty likely that they're going to be negative themselves. In Brian's case, this is maybe why he kicks and hits others. Some limitations to social constructivism is that it pays little attention to biological factors. It doesn't take into account that anxiety or depression can stem from trauma. So I think if this lens could be enhanced, it could address biological factors. So some contrasts of these theories are that cognitive, Piaget, cognitive, and Erikson's are both stage-based. However, cognitive stops at 11 years, whereas Erikson's is an entire lifespan. Social constructivism is not stage-based. Erikson looks at social factors, where constructivism looks at environmental factors. And what have I learned from this? So childhood trauma can be very complex, and it can come in many different forms. Every individual responds to trauma differently. Some may be affected, while others may not be. Trauma can be physically painful, or it may not. But it does bring painful experiences that can impact someone for a lifetime. It can impact our thinking, our behaviors, our emotions, and Piaget, Erikson, and social constructivism can help us understand how trauma has impacted a child. Hopefully, by understanding, we can help children manage those negative effects. So yeah, this concludes my presentation. I hope that you have a wonderful day and have a great summer. Take care.